Hi, we continue in 2 Samuel 8 today as we continue to walk through this series of David's consolidation of the legitimacy of his royal reign. And last time we looked at the beginning of 2 Samuel 8 here as part of this larger chunk here from 2 Samuel 8 to 10. And we also noticed how one level these three chapters are connected by a pattern that we saw in 1 Samuel 24 to 26 with parallel stories around the frame and the story in the middle of David taking control of the house of a threatened enemy, of Saul in the first case and of Nabal in the first case and of Saul's house in this case. But as I looked at briefly last time, and we'll look at it more as we get further on, as Isaac Kalimi has shown in this article in 2016, we can also connect chapter 10 as a frame around the Bathsheba and Uriah story here, where the end of the war story continues here to frame it at the end. So we'll see how all this is tightly connected against scholars who see this as a series of different sources and see it as a jumble of different pieces. But one of the things we'll see in this section is, whether it's from one source or another, I'm not going to get into, but there's certainly multiple voices. And as I was noting in the first part in chapter 8, 1 to 6 in the last video, using the work of Baruch Halpern and others, the element of royal propaganda is what we focused on. So the story looked like it was saying that David killed and defeated a bunch of people. That was more of a matter of the New RSV's wrong translation of the Hebrew word that's translated, or that means every time struck, as you can see here. Struck, 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 and sometimes it's translated defeated and killed, which makes it sound like he did much more than what the text actually says in its ambiguity. So we looked at these verses and shown how one can get the impression that David conquered everybody, but when you look closer, it doesn't say so much. But in the second half today, from verse 7, we're going to see there's an ironic anti-monarchical piece in here, because we'll hear in this first part about the gold and bronze that anticipates the very end of 2 Kings, when the Babylonians take the gold and bronze back to Babylon. So what David's taking from other people and bringing to Jerusalem, ironically, will be taken away in the same kind of way later. And we'll also see that when he wins a name for himself, there's an ambiguity in that. And then finally, we'll see when it says he reigned over all Israel and administered justice and equity, that will recall us to the mishpat, the justice of the king, back in 1 Samuel 8. And as a number of scholars have noted, there's a certain irony here in the whole thing, that at one level, we can read this positively, that David is a wonderful king, and that's how many have named it. But we can also hear this entire thing as a betrayal of the will of Yahweh, who is truly the king over you. And we'll see that how the phrase mishpat tzedakah, justice and equity translated here, plays out in echoes, not only in the Deuteronomistic history elsewhere in the monarchy, but also among the prophets and others that would well be known to the audience. Finally, we'll see there's a refrain that connects our sections here. So this phrase, and Yahweh gave victory to David wherever he went in verse 14, we already heard up here at the end of verse 6. That's why I stopped there. And certainly this part is another unit here, as we can see. So let's just jump right through, and we'll show what the implications are of reading it from a different level. So already noting that he had not destroyed everybody, the earlier people had come and brought tribute to him. And now he's showing what that tribute is. And so what we're seeing, he's basically taking some things and making these people subject to them. So he's not destroying them, and he's not taking their territory. He's simply defeating them in a battle that leads them to offer him some compensation. But as far as we can tell, they're completely free. They're not under his reign in any direct way. It doesn't say that. It just says these things. So let's look at what it says, and we can infer what it doesn't say. So he took the gold shields. Plainly, the word gold, sorry, I didn't highlight that, is gold here, and we'll see it more in verse 8 and verse 11. The word for shields is ambiguous, and I won't get in all the etymological issue. As Samora suggests, it could mean quiver or bow case. He notes that shields has no etymological support. But the key issue is the gold. And so we see the gold here below, but notice here at the very end of 2 Kings, it ends in chapter 25, we see these two passages. First in 24:13, he, this is the king of Babylon, carried off all the treasures of the house of Yahweh. He cut in pieces all the vessels of gold of the temple of Yahweh, which King Solomon of Israel had made, all this as Yahweh had foretold. And then finally, in almost the very last verses, and this is part of a long-going list of this, what was made of gold, the captain of the guard took away for the gold, and what was made of silver for the silver, and the pillars, and the bronze, and all of it. So what we can see here is that what David is doing here in a small way will be anticipating in a big way that having it come back around against Jerusalem. So we saw the servants of King Hadadezer. He was accompanying one of David's enemies in the last scene. So then David subdued him. Again, we don't need to worry about the details of the names. And similarly, these two towns we know nothing about either of them. They're only named here, and from there, we hear that he took a great amount of bronze. And again, the bronze connects to the exact same passage. Notice how this scans the entire Deuteronomistic history. So we hear in Deuteronomy 8:9 here that God will bring you into a land where you may eat bread without scarcity, where you will lack nothing, a land whose stones are iron, and from whose hills you may mine copper, and eat your fill, etc. But don't forget. And notice in this section here also is do not exalt yourself, forgetting Yahweh your God. And I'd like to suggest that's part of exactly what happens here. Where is Yahweh in all this? Where are the people of Israel? Notice this is all just about David, and we can see it if we look at it on the right side of the screen here. David did this, David did this, David took, David struck, David had struck, David took. But where are the people? Where's Israel? It's just a one-man operation. It's all about raising up the name of David here. And we'll see the text highlights exactly that point in just a couple of verses. So here we hear another king, King Toi of Hamath, as Sumera notes, in the north, in the middle of the Orontes River. And if we want to look at the map, we can see how far away this is. Way up here. Jerusalem is way down here. And the likelihood that a tiny little capital city like Jerusalem, which doesn't even have a temple yet, and certainly is small and not very wealthy, could have soldiers that were going all the way up here is certainly unbelievable. Would the audience here even know where these places were? Probably not. But we see that he's supposedly opposing people from Hamath and Zobah. And as I was noting last time, Halpern suggests, and others do as well, that perhaps some of these battles are taken from stylized battles from elsewhere in the monarchy, and expecting that people just won't remember. And readers of the Bible have often not remembered, even though the text is right there for people like Halpern to find and show us. So when he heard the defeated, again struck like every time, he sent his son Joram to King David, and not to greet him and congratulate him, but to Shaul to ask his peace and to bless him. Again, using Shaul, one of the ironies throughout is to ask is the name of the king that David has replaced. And David's name means beloved, if you hadn't been aware of that. So to ask his peace, to seek his peace, and to bless him, not just to congratulate him, but to bless him, as if this man could bless another king. Obviously, blessing in that sense is not like the blessing we know in Genesis, which can only come from Yahweh. Because he had fought against Hadadezer, Nilkam, the word for fought, only here in the chapter, and it'll be parallel on the other side of the parallel shape in chapter 10, and again, and struck him. And it notes that they had been enemies, and so now obviously Toi is wanting to ally with David for a common enemy, and that's what happens here. And then we hear something interesting. King David dedicated to Yahweh with the silver and gold that he had dedicated from the nations. But what does that mean in this context? The word here, Hagadesh, means to make holy, whether of a person or an object. But what does it mean that David made these holy? There's no temple. There's no place to put them in that sense. David isn't a priest, although we'll hear in the next video that along with two people who we know as priests, he will make his sons into priests, and we'll have to look at what that might mean. But it never says that David is a priest, and so what does it mean to make these objects holy? These objects that he had taken from other people. We'll just have to leave that for now. To the nations he subdued. Again, using kabish here. This is not the same word for subdued earlier. We only heard it once in Joshua, so it's not a common word. It's really just suggesting a temporary defeat. And when we've seen other words for subdued, as we saw earlier in 1 Samuel, it certainly doesn't mean they're defeated. But when we look at this verse, this summary verse, we recognize that something else ironic is happening. It's not only looking to the end of the story, when all the gold and bronze is taken by the Babylonians, it's noting in a subtle way that maybe the reign of David is going to end up parallel to the reign of Saul. Because let's put right against this 1 Samuel 14, 47, and 48. And we know when we listen to that, when Saul had taken the kingship over Israel, he fought against all his enemies on every side, against Moab, against the Ammonites, against Edom, against the kings of Zobah, and against the Philistines. Wherever he turned, he routed them. He did valiantly and struck down, notice struck down again, the Amalekites and rescued Israel out of the hands of those who plundered him. And we note that other than the Amalekites, it's the exact same list of people, and here they are, Amalek, which is otherwise not in this passage at all. And so plainly this is meant to echo that. And what happens after that in 1 Samuel 15 is that Samuel gives him the command to kill the king, to destroy all the Amalekites, including the king and all the sheep and cattle, and he doesn't. And Samuel says in the name of Yahweh that Yahweh is now replacing you. And what we'll see after these chapters is with the Bathsheba incident, the house of David comes apart. And although he's not replaced, although he'll stave off the rebellion of his son Absalom, the old David is hardly the young, vibrant David that we've been seeing so far. So perhaps it's saying something, and we'll have another hint of that this is the tragic arc of monarchy, and maybe the tragic arc of Israel, that you want to be powerful, you want to have a king, you get one, and the king becomes famous, and you end up in exile. And you'd have to read the entire story to judge that, but I'd like to suggest that's one of the hints that's going on here, that right at the peak of David's power are the seeds of the defeat, not only of David, but of the entire monarchical adventure. So we see all those now, and then we have a couple of summaries. We have here the narrator summarizing he won a name for himself, or literally made a name. One suggests that somebody else is giving it to him, but the literal is he made it. And notice how that echoes in the larger context, and I've noted a number of times both in my Genesis series and here that there are deep connections between Genesis as an anti-monarchical story from after the exile. So we can hear David made a name for himself, and how similar that is to the tower people in Genesis 11 who sought to make a name for themselves so they wouldn't be forgotten. The for himself is not actually in the Hebrew, so it's simply he made a name. And when he returned, it said he killed 18,000 Edomites. And I'd like to suggest that there's another irony here. The fact that he made a name is echoing that we saw here back in 1 Samuel 18:7 and 21:11 and 29:5. Saul is killed his thousands and David is killed his tens of thousands. And it's exactly in this context that the text says he killed 18,000, although yet again it's struck, not killed. The story here in the Valley of Salt suggests to Naaman that this is a reflection of this story here in 2 Kings 14, which also involves the Edomites in the Valley of Salt, although it has 10,000. What the relationship is between those two accounts I won't begin to get into, but that's one of the hints that perhaps this story is taking that story and turning it into something that's about David. And then it continues here that he put garrisons in Edom. Throughout all Edom he put garrisons. Notice the symmetry of that as a little one-sentence chiasm. And all the Edomites became David's servants. As Baden notes below, the fact that in Solomon's time this area was still referred to as Edomite suggests that it was not annexed to Israel, but rather controlled by Israel, making the same point I've been making, that all these places are simply under immediate control of David, but not becoming Israelite territory. It seems most likely that David's conquest of Edom consisted mostly of his seizure of the southern Negeb, which we can see down here, and the establishment of garrisons to protect his trade route. Remarkably, archaeological evidence supports this process, suggesting that what's really happening here is David's establishing trade routes here. And we'll see how when the moment Solomon becomes king, it's Hiram of Tyre who comes to his aid. And so we'll see certainly there are hints that some network was already established up here. But interestingly, Hiram is not mentioned here, and Tyre and Sidon are not mentioned among the people that David is engaging. And Yahweh gave victory, or not victory, as my note from the key words highlights here, not victory, but gave all to David wherever he went. Even victory is an over-translation. So now we get to the summary statement, and this is really a key of some of the deeper irony. He reigned over all Israel. At this point, notice not Israel and Judah, that all Israel has become a symbol for the entire unified nation. And as many scholars have noted, it's really only under David and Solomon that there's one nation. Whether before or after, Israel and Judah were really separate polities, and although they worshiped the same God Yahweh, their sense of community and their sense of organization were not that similar, and some of their traditions may well have been different too. Whether we think of that as like northern European nations that are similar, Sweden, Norway, etc., we can call them Scandinavian, and yet they're distinct nations, or we can imagine what might have happened if the American Civil War had turned out differently, and there was a Confederate States of America and Northern States of America. At the time I'm making this video, more of a chance of that happening again than at any time in the last more than 100 years. So we'll see how that goes, but maybe it gives you a sense of how to relate to two nations that are connected but still remain separate. But here they're consolidated under one. And then it says he administered, or literally made again, justice and equity, or mishpat isedekah. as we see here. And this is where I'd like to take some time to look at the uses of that phrase, which in many ways can be two separate terms, but also hendiadys, saying one concept, fair and just rule. And so, interestingly, this is the first time we see it in the sequence of the Bible. It's not in the Torah at all, because it's inherently a political term about leading a people. It's not primarily about individuals alone, but about individuals within a community of people. And so this is the first time we hear it mentioned. It's not in Joshua, Judges, or Deuteronomy. And the only other time we hear it mentioned in the monarchy is around Solomon, when the Queen of Sheba, in all her praise, says, Yahweh loved Israel forever. He has made you king to execute justice and righteousness. Notice it didn't say Solomon did it. It just said he's been made king to do that. And I've organized these uses. These are not all of them. Some of them are trivial and not related to our theme. But organize them around the ones that refer to Davidic or other kings or leaders, the ones referring to Yahweh, and then one to the people in general. So we see in the prophets, and they're almost all in the major prophets. That's the other places we hear. This is not a term in the wisdom literature anywhere except once in Psalms and once in Job, as you can see below. So simply Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and as you can see also one reference from Amos, and that's all. So Isaiah says, a king will reign in righteousness and princes will rule with righteousness. Isaiah writing probably at the time of Hezekiah, the king later in Second Kings. And then Jeremiah here, thus says Yahweh to the king, act with justice and righteousness and deliver from the hand of the oppressor anyone who has been robbed, and no wrong or violence to the alien, the orphan, and the widow, etc. Those are always the bellwethers of the state of justice among the people of Yahweh, is how you treat the most vulnerable in the bottom of society in a hierarchical, organized sense. Jeremiah goes on later, just a few verses later, to a specific king, Shallum, son of King Josiah, who's about to become king. And notice the difference, the recollection here of exactly what's going to happen around David and Solomon. We saw in last chapter, 2 Samuel 7, that David seemed disturbed because he lived in a house of cedar and Yahweh was still in a box. And so that's being brought up here way later in the context of Jeremiah. Are you a king because you compete in cedar? Did not your father, Josiah, eat and drink and do justice and righteousness? Whether we think Josiah did is a matter of understanding of what you think justice and righteousness is, because the main thing Josiah did was centralize worship of Yahweh in Jerusalem and destroy the people and places outside of Jerusalem, like in Bethel, where in Genesis 28, Jacob, Mr. Israel himself, has the experience. It says, God was in this place and I didn't know it. But Josiah is not reading Genesis. Genesis was certainly written in response to Josiah, among other things. But that's from my Genesis series. But just to highlight how these texts are all interacting with each other. Then we see a little later in Jeremiah, the days are coming when I will raise up for David a righteous branch and shall execute justice and righteousness. So that's the hope. And then also in Ezekiel, writing from exile, in the section on the New Jerusalem, in Ezekiel 40 to 48, to do what is just and right. But it's Yahweh who does that. Yahweh filled Zion with justice and righteousness. I, Yahweh, act with chesed, here, justice and righteousness. And here in the Psalm, Yahweh as the mighty king, lover of justice, has established equity in Jacob, which is to say Israel. And then in Job also, the Almighty, he is great in power and justice and abundant righteousness. Here, negative examples, and later in Isaiah, justice is turned back and righteousness stands at a distance. And this is a whole section of Isaiah critical of how the leaders have led the people astray. In the previous chapter, 58, we hear how they've gotten fat off the sheep. And similarly in Ezekiel 33, I say to the wicked, you shall surely die, yet if they turn away and do what is lawful and right, which is the same phrase, just translated this way here. And then in Amos, in the passage most famous from Martin Luther King's proclamation, let justice roll down like water and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. But that comes in response to a God who's crying out, take away from the noise of your songs that will not listen to the melody of your harps. So I don't want you just to make empty church music at me. I want you to practice what I have shown you, justice and righteousness. But the great irony here is that the mishpat of the king, as established in 1 Samuel 8, was to take. We saw that's what kings do. They take. And the irony is that's exactly what we've seen David do in this scene. He's taken. And if we want to put it this way, what he's engaged in is violence, murder, and theft. if he wasn't a king and he was just somebody else doing this would simply be robbery. He's going to these places and he's taking things, or he's extorting them. He's doing to these people what he tried to do to Nabal back in 1 Samuel 25, which is not too far removed because it's the ironic pairing here with what we'll see in chapter 9, that he went up to Nabal and threatened basically that if you don't give me what I want, I won't leave any of your men to piss against the wall. In the crude Hebrew, that's the most English translations are too embarrassed to put in that way. But that was exactly the point. At the time, David was leaving a band of misfits and outsiders, and now he's the king. But the behavior is hardly different. It's just the legitimation of having the title king that makes this behavior something you would celebrate rather than something you would call criminal. And that's the brilliance of royal propaganda then and now. It takes acts that if ordinary people did them, we would put them in jail or want them executed, and instead to raise them up as our heroes when they lead us in battle against our enemies. And so that's the summary of our scene here, and we'll see as it continues, it will name the first example of a cabinet, which is, say, his royal advisors. And although that's only a few verses, we're going to spend a whole video on that because I want to trace out the lineage of these people so we can see how this is pointing to the entire reign and beyond to continue the irony. So see you for that next time. Bye-bye.